Take him to Detroit.
No! No, not Detroit! No! No, please! Anything but that! No!
I grew up in a small town south of Detroit. Most of the people in my family are or were employed at a factory, machine shop, or assembly plant in the area. Around here, it's common to hear a lot of stories about people getting killed or maimed by machinery or some other hazard at the workplace. As my father used to put it, things at the plants were a lot different before those assholes at Occupational Safety and Health Administration came in and changed everything. After hearing a few stories myself, I never understood why Dad thought Occupational Safety and Health Administration was a bad thing. I was just a humble security guard at one of these places. The plant that I used to work at was a foundry back in the 1950s up until it was shut down and converted into a warehouse at some point in the 1980s. For those of you that don't know what a foundry is, it's a factory where steel gets casted into different forms. My story starts in 2006 when I got hired by a contracted security company. I was assigned to a midnight shift at this place. Some of the older people there used to tell me that the place was built on top of a county-owned graveyard, but I'm pretty sure it was just an old man trying to scare the younger guys. Interestingly enough, the place I worked at was the first factory in the country where a person was killed by an automated machine. We had to do a patrol round through the basement of this place. The first time I went down there, it was just as I imagined, dirty, dusty, lots and lots of junk and spare parts, and best of all, nice and dark. While you were down there, you couldn't get a cell phone signal, and our handheld radios got a spotty signal at best. In what I think was an effort to save energy, they had installed motion-activated lights that would stay on for about 20 minutes before turning off and would turn on when you were within 7 or 8 feet of walking underneath them. So one night in the summer of 2006, I was doing my rounds down there. There was one area where for some reason or another the automatic lights wouldn't turn on. As part of the round, you had to walk straight through this area, so I always carried a flashlight for the occasion. I was about halfway through my round when I had to walk through this dark area when I saw the shadow of what appeared to be the outline of a man walk out about 12 feet or so in front of me. He walked behind a support column and disappeared. I thought to myself about how strange that was and continued on my way, thinking that it could have been someone else down there messing with me. I had to go back down there the next night, and this time something felt different. There was a strange stir in the air, and I hate to admit it, but it felt as if I were being followed. Whatever this feeling was, I couldn't shake it. I make my way back to the area where I'd seen the shadow the night before, this time no shadow man. I made my way into an area that was like a big hallway, and of course it was dark and I wasn't close enough to activate the lights. I stood there for a second looking into the darkness when about halfway down the hall a light came on, then another and another. So me with my flashlight standing ready to swing at whatever was coming down the hall towards me felt a slight cold breeze. The real strange thing was that my co-workers were having similar experiences of seeing shadows and feeling cold gusts of air in places where you shouldn't. I ended up working there for way too long, and in that time I saw the shadow man several more times and felt the cold breeze a lot too. I've since moved on from that place, but I do have a lot more creepy stories about it and other experiences that I've had. But I do wonder sometimes if these things I saw were just tricks of the light or people that meet their end and are still on the job. In the fall of 2007, I decided that I'd done enough research into the paranormal, and it was time I got out into the field to do some serious work. I had done some looking around, and I had gotten in touch with a local paranormal group that was kind enough to take the time to give me a trial run of sorts. We met up at a restaurant and had discussed the finer points of what the night's festivities were going to be, the investigation of a local cemetery that was reported to be extremely active. The place had an interesting history. Supposedly it was the resting place of a witch that had been hung sometime around 1870. No doubt by angry townsfolk with pitchforks and torches, and the entire family that owned the land was buried there as well. At this point, I had already read enough and experimented with trying to record EVPs with little to no success, and I also had a digital camcorder that I had played around with a little bit. It was after dark when we finally found the old cemetery. We all stayed pretty close together and decided it was time to leave when we found a protest truck around 11 p.m. We all stood around it wondering, 1, what is a truck like this doing parked in the back of a cemetery, and 2, go figure, go out looking for ghosts and find this thing. Well, about the time we started walking away from the truck, we saw a man wearing dark blue mechanics coveralls walking to the truck and getting in it. The truck had a camper in the back of it. Well, after the too close for comfort run-in with the Mitchell Myers look-alike, we left and all met back up in the parking lot of the restaurant we'd met at earlier. We said our goodbyes and called it a night. We were out there for about 2 hours or so, and I had about 90 minutes of video to go through and about 30 minutes of audio recordings to listen to the next day. I never got anything on the EVP, but the video was interesting. About 20 minutes or so and I was holding my camera and I had two people walking in front of me. They were about 15 feet ahead of me. In the bottom left-hand corner of the screen you could see the outline of a shadow run out from behind a headstone. It ran up behind the person that was in front of me and then vanished. This shadow object couldn't have been but maybe 2.5 feet tall, and for some reason I always thought it was the image of a little girl. I never went back to that place, and since that time I've lost contact with those people. I think I may have actually got something on camera. I can't be too sure about it. But I can tell you this. Everyone I've ever seen that video sees the shadow run out from behind the headstone, and everyone that's seen it gets just a little bit creeped out by it.
Nain Rouge is a legendary creature, urban legend from French and American folklore and one of the Lutins, comparable to hobgoblins in other cultures. Unlike the other Lutins, Nain Rouge is an evil creature that is feared as an omen of great misfortune, and whenever he appears and is described as more frightening than the generally hospitable Lutins. His appearance is said to presage terrible events for the city. The Nain Rouge appears as a small childlike creature with red or black fur boots. It is also said to have blazing red eyes and rotten teeth. The creature is said to have attacked the first white settler of Detroit in 1701, Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac, who, soon after, lost his fortune. The creature is also said to have appeared on July 30, 1763 before the Battle of Bloody Run, where 58 British soldiers were killed by Native Americans from Chief Pontiac's tribe. A small tributary of the Detroit River which still flows through what is now Elmwood Cemetery turned red with blood for days after the battle. It is said he was seen dancing on the banks of the Detroit River. Famous multiple sightings occurred in the days before the 1805 fire which destroyed most of Detroit. General William Hull reported a dwarf attack in the fog just before his surrender of Detroit in the War of 1812. A woman claimed to have been attacked in 1884 and described the creature as resembling a baboon with a horned head, brilliant restless eyes, and a devilish leer on its face. Another attack was reported in 1964. Other sightings include the day before the 12th Street riot in 1967 and before a huge ice storm of March 1976, when two utility workers are said to have seen what they thought was a child climbing a utility pole, which then jumped from the top of the pole and ran away as they approached. More recently, in the autumn of 1996, according to an article in the Michigan Believer, the Nain Rouge was spotted by two admittedly drunken nightclub patrons, who claimed to both have heard a strange cawing sound, similar to a crow, coming from a small hunched-over man who was fleeing the scene of a car burglary. The creature was described as wearing what looked like a really nasty torn fur coat.
I would like to tell you about an experience that my friend and I went through recently in Detroit, Michigan on Saturday, August 3, 2013. It was a typical Saturday night. My friend and I were hanging out around the neighborhood and not really doing much at all. We decided to walk over to Parian Park and smoke some weed and just hang out. This was at about 9:30 p.m. We walked over and found a bench that was a bit out of the way and would provide us some privacy to let us smoke in peace. At about 11 p.m. we decided to leave the park when we heard some rustling in the trees behind us, followed by what sounded like laughter, tiny high-pitched, almost childlike laughter. We thought at first it was someone messing with us and stood up and yelled out, "Cut it out, jackasses, we're not falling for it." This was met with more laughter and more rustling from the trees. Suddenly two small people jumped out of the tree and almost floated down to the ground in front of us. We jumped back when we saw these two small people, almost yelling from the sudden surprise that their sudden appearance had given us. These two small people, both looked male, could not have been any more than 4 feet tall, stocky, and looked like they were wearing green three-piece suits. They looked almost like they were wearing leprechaun costumes and carrying what looked like walking sticks. My friend later told me that they looked almost like Hornswoggle from the WWE, which I had to agree that they really did. They looked at us for about 5 seconds, no sound, and no movement. We were totally and completely freaked out and decided to get out of there as quickly as possible. The moment we moved to start backing away, these two things jumped at us, covering the 6 or 7 feet between us in a single instant. They were on top of us, screaming loudly as they bit, scratched, and hit us with the sticks that they were carrying. They were screaming in such an inhuman way, it sounded like an animal in distress crossed with a feral human. They were ripping at our clothes, swinging at our heads with these sticks that they were carrying, all the while laughing and screaming at the top of their lungs. My friend and I were overpowered, and all we could do was try to get away from these creatures and protect our heads from these sticks that they were swinging. Almost as quickly as it started, it ended, and they leaped off of us and bolted toward the trees and disappeared with nothing more than maniacal laughter. We got up and sprinted home as fast as we could go. We got home to my house and quickly shut the door and bolted it shut before we bothered to try to breathe easy and figure out what just happened to us. Both my friend and I were both busted up pretty bad with a collection of scratches, scrapes, and welts to show for our encounter. We stayed the rest of the night. We were hurting so much the next day that it was impossible for us to move without groaning in pain. We have never seen anything like these two creatures before and could not come up with an explanation as to what it was that attacked us that night. I decided to write in after researching about people reporting sightings of dwarfs, gnomes, and whatnot. I didn't think we would be seeing something like this in the middle of Detroit, Michigan, but we did, and we know what we saw. We know that this sounds incredible and you might try to dismiss it as fantasy made up by two crazy men, but we know that what we saw was real and what happened to us was definitely real. We have never spoken about it except amongst ourselves, and I decided to write to you and share my story in hopes of finding an answer to what it was that happened to us.
The summer after graduating high school in the Metro Detroit area of Michigan, almost every weekend was grad party after grad party. Towards the end of the summer, one of my closest friends had him at his house. Now, his house backs up to a small wooded area, probably no more than 50 to 100 yards deep and maybe 20 to 30 yards across. It's small enough to where you can see the house on the other side of it during the day and some of the lights on in that house at night. Additionally, the houses surrounding his belong primarily to the elderly, so no one is out past 10 o'clock or so. Finally, we had never drank or tried any sort of intoxicating substance until months after this all occurred. This all comes into play as the night begins to unfold. Once it started to get dark out, the party died off. At this point it was only me, him, and 3 of our friends. Around 10 p.m. we thought it would be a good night for a bonfire, so we got some wood together, along with the lighter fluid and lighter, and got a nice little fire going. We spent a good hour or so just having a good time sharing stories and laughing, until one of our friends had to leave. This left only 4 of us until about half an hour later, when one of our other friends had to leave. So her boyfriend took her home and told us he'd be back in a little bit. Suddenly it was the 2 of us. This is when things got interesting. As my friend sat facing back towards the woods, and I with my back to the woods, we started hearing some noises. Sticks cracking on the ground, leaves being brushed through, those sort of things. He laughed it off, saying it was just the neighbor's cat. As we sat and continued to shoot the shit, the noises continued and I continued to brush them off under the assumption it was just a cat. However, I was a little unnerved when we both heard what sounded like footsteps in the front yard. At first we thought our friend had gotten back but realized it wasn't him after a few minutes had gone by. Eventually our friend came back from dropping his girlfriend off at home and we started talking again like nothing had ever happened. A couple minutes later, however, the noises from the woods started up again, but this time they were closer. Much closer. I could see my friend was clearly unnerved by this, and I reminded him he told me it was just a cat. He looked at me and told me that they didn't have a cat. He just said that to reassure himself earlier that it was nothing. I quickly got up, moved to the other side of the fire, and sat down between my 2 friends so that we were all facing the woods. After using a few choice words towards my friend to express how I felt about him letting me sit with my back towards whatever was back there, things took a bit of a turn. We saw something move in the brush. It was slight, but noticeable. It looked fairly big too, about 5 feet tall. Kind of human-like. We tried to joke it off and convince ourselves it was nothing. This worked until a few moments later when we started to see more movement. This continued for a couple minutes until it got significantly closer and we decided to go inside. We hurried as we started to grab everything we needed to take in and put the lid on the fire pit, really just an old dome-shaped metal BBQ grill without the legs. Throughout this time it continued to move closer to us. It almost seemed hesitant yet curious as we saw it dart about. Nonetheless, we rushed inside. We locked the door behind us and went to the windows. By this point it knew we were inside and was coming up to the house. It would dart by the windows as we ran between the windows and the house in hopes we could catch a glimpse of what had us so scared. We made out some basic details. It was about 4 to 5 feet tall when it was hunched over, humanoid and pale. Almost white but still a little gray kind of pale. This lasted for a good 10 minutes until we heard the scratching of nails on the wooden deck connected to the house. Around this time it seemed to shift its focus towards the fire as we apparently didn't put the lid back on completely. Before I knew it, my friend was calling us over to the window that faced the fire. The lid was off and we could see the shape of it darting around the fire. We later found the lid about 10 feet away from the pit. Something had to have picked it up by the hot metal handle and thrown it over there. Around this time we also noticed that it was around some of the other windows. It was then that we realized there wasn't just one of whatever it was. There were multiple. If I had to guess, I'd say there were about 4 or 5. This general activity continued for about 20 minutes until I decided I was going home. Our other friend decided he would do the same at that point, so neither of us would have to walk to our cars alone. We both parked maybe 20 to 30 yards from the house, but since the activity had only increased since it started, 20 yards seemed like a mile because of our nerves. After our friend tried and failed to convince us to stay the night there with him, we left out the front door into our cars within about 30 seconds. As we went to get in our cars, however, we faced the backyard and both saw multiple of the things crouched down about halfway to the ground. Some in open parts of the yard looking at us and some behind the trees looking back at the house. As we both drove away, I looked back and saw the shape of a head looking into one of the windows of the house. As we left his neighborhood, which is kind of hidden in a wooded area, we both saw something cross the street behind our cars. As soon as we both got back to our houses, we got onto our group chat to confirm what we saw after leaving the house. Any doubt I had about what I saw was quickly thrown out the window as soon as my friend described what he saw without any input as to what I saw. As the three of us recounted the night in our group chat, my friend continued to update us on the events still unfolding at his house. Besides seeing the figures outside his window still, he claimed he saw a face in the window at one point. Pale skin and black eyes. He described them as almost being like holes in the face, they were so dark. He also claimed at one point something had scratched the screen on his window. Well, I guess we're not the most sensible because the next night we were right back at it. We knew what we saw and we needed validation. This time we had another person stay with us so they could back up our claims. We needed evidence that was better than just our word. It was too dark to take pictures or video. We set the night up just like the previous. Everyone got to the house, we got a nice fire going, and we waited for things to start up. Once it got dark out, we started hearing the rustling in the brush again. An hour or so later the noises got closer and I switched sides so that all 4 of us were facing the wooded area. Within minutes, we saw whatever was out there moving through the brush again. There were probably about 2 or 3 at this point. They were surrounding us. We got up and calmly tried to put the lid back on the fire. We figured if we showed we were afraid, they might go for us. As soon as we finished getting the lid on the fire and grabbed everything we needed, we rushed inside. Before we knew it, they were darting past the windows again. At this point, the 4th person, who hadn't been with us during it all the night before, agreed that something was out there. As time passed, we gathered up the courage to go back out and stand on the deck and try and get some kind of evidence. We stood out there as they got closer. There were more this time. Maybe 5 or 6. We stood there in silence as we observed them. They almost seemed curious with a hint of mischief. Some watched us, some ran around. One even scratched the underside of the deck directly beneath my feet. I could feel it as its nail dragged across the wood. At one point a deer ran out of the wooded area just a bit further down the road. It was like it was running away from something, but definitely not us because it ran somewhat towards us. Not away from us. Throughout this time I had been recording audio on my phone. At first, it didn't seem like I captured anything. Going through the recordings the next day, however, I noticed something. Something short but apparent. I isolated the snippet of audio and used an online tool to amplify the volume several times so that it could be heard more clearly. That's when it struck me, it was almost like a growl. After all this, we hurried back into the house. The 3 of us left and, again, we saw whatever they were in the yard as we bolted to our cars. Almost a year has passed since those nights and the thought of it all still terrifies me to this day. What's more, as I was out driving the other night, I decided to pass through his neighborhood to sort of reminisce about old times. As I was driving through, I saw those same pale figures, hunched over and moving about. There were about 4 or 5 of them. I'm posting this because I'm looking for answers. Any idea as to what we might have seen those nights, please let me know. The events still haunt my memories to this day.
About a year ago, I was looking out my back door when I was letting my dog out at 3 o'clock in the morning and there was a dragonfly-shaped craft that flew past my backyard. Even though it was going towards Metro Airport, it wasn't going in that direction, it was going from east to west. They had 4 wings, 2 wings up, 2 wings down, orange lights all the way around, every wing and the craft itself. And it probably passed a distance of 3 miles in less than 2 seconds. I would say it was probably about the size of, not quite as big as, like, the jets that would go over going to Metro, but it was only about 200 feet in the air. It was barely covering the treetops. I didn't hear anything. I don't really watch a lot of TV or news, so most of my time is watching or listening to Coast, but there was nothing on local news, no. It was a year ago this month. It was just breaking spring and it was the strangest thing, but it wasn't the first time. Back in 2000 I saw 2 white saucers that were hovering about a mile away and they were just there and I blinked because it was the middle of the day and I thought, oh, that's all just a cloud passing by, but it wasn't. It was 2 flying saucers and they were both side by side and one went poof, gone, the other one went poof, and it was gone, as well. So the visual experiences of UFOs that have crossed over my area, and I'm about 15 miles from Metro Airport, so I'm used to planes going over and, hearing those kinds of things, but these were silent, these were absolutely no sound whatsoever. One in the middle of the day and one at 3 o'clock in the morning. I looked up on. I tried to Google it. I went to several sites to see if I could find something similar and I only came across something that was slightly similar. It had 2 wings going up and 2 wings going down, but there were no lights. These were orange lights, kind of like Halloween orange looking lights. That color orange. It was all the way around, each wing, all 4 of them, all the way around the body of the craft. No sound and it was going so fast that I didn't even have time to even open. I was letting my dog out at 3 o'clock in the morning, so, anyways, I didn't have time to even open the door and close the door, and that's how fast it was going. So I redid it in my mind. I was going 1001 1002, and so that's about 2 seconds, and that's how fast it went across about a 3-mile area.
As a young fellow in radio, we all knew each other. Even if we were competitors, I would know the guy across town at the other radio station. And although the general managers and salespeople would think the staff at the other stations were the enemy, we all got along just fine. Of course, we never gave up secrets or mentioned what the station was planning on doing. Truth be told, we would enjoy the art of one-upmanship with each other. After work, we would meet at various places, the news directors and talent at a high-end bar, and the lowly DJs at some mediocre bar, and sometimes strip club. Occasionally, when management would not be looking, we would go to the other station and sit in with a friend and shoot the bull as he would be doing his job. Sometimes offering a joke or in some cases calling from an adjacent room pretending to be a listener. If you ever heard Gary Burbank do his Earl Pits, occasionally we would do something like that just for fun. I think the best one I ever did was with my friend Rick at the country radio station. Rick was an ex-Vietnam vet who was very talented on the air, quick wit, dry sense of humor, often making a joke at the expense of a caller to the request line. We hit it off because we had met a few times at a gun range, and shared the hobbies of guns, shortwave radio, etc. On my night off I would call up Rick on the request line, and he would put me on the air as Ted the Truckie, an over-the-road truck driver who was always getting lost on the road. Rick's station was in Detroit, and Ted would call in from somewhere saying he's lost and looking to get directions or telling a wild story about something. Hey Rick, this is Ted. I'm sort of lost.
Where are you at now?
I'm in Frankenstein.
Where?
Frankenstein. I'm on my way to the Ford plant in Romeo, and I think I overshot and wound up here. To cut to the chase, Frankenstein was actually Frankenmuth, Michigan. The gag would go on for a minute before the next song was played. Anyway, I was with Rick in the studio one night at his station. The station was in sort of a nice-looking building near 6 Mile Road and the Southfield Freeway. The studio was about 20 by 20 feet, soundproofed, and a huge picture window in the wall in front of the DJ looking out on the hallway. This was so when the big talent was working days, management could bring clients down the hall to watch the DJ work without going into the studio. At times it was a distraction since people would be coming up and down the hall in front of you as you would be working on the air. Rick had the 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. shift, which was lonely since, typically, Rick would be the only one there. After 5 p.m. the office left. After 7 p.m. the news department left, and the guy who you took over for at 11 p.m. would typically bolt out of the studio to go party or see a skirt. I sat in back of Rick while he sat at his control board, and when a record was playing on the air we would talk, joke, and generally be rude to each other. At 12 a.m. in the morning the place was empty, and the news department wouldn't come in until 4 a.m. to prepare for news at 5:30 a.m. We were the only ones there. We were talking, and he leaned to the right to cue up another record when I saw this older gentleman walk down the hall without looking in. He appeared to be in his 60s, white crew-cut hair, somewhat stocky, with a tattoo on his right forearm. Rick, it looks like the news department is early.
What do you mean?
I just saw someone walk down the hall.
What did he look like?
I explained what I saw, and Rick, looking perturbed, sort of made a face of disgust and went back to sorting records. What's the matter? Rick spun his chair around and looked at me very seriously.
Just forget about it.
Odd reaction, I thought. Who is he? Rick seemed annoyed.
We call him Gus. Nobody knows his name. We just call him Gus.
Odd, I thought. Nobody knows him. And he's wandering your building.
Yeah, we don't know anything about him, and some of the other guys call him Gus, so that's what I call him.
Rick paused, turned his head slightly, then looked me in the eyes.
Gus is dead.
Dead? What do you mean he's dead? Rick then went on to explain the sightings of Gus, and sometimes the interactions other employees of the radio station would have. Papers would be tossed off tables. Your coat would be missing from the hook in the employee break room and be found elsewhere in the building. Car keys moved if left out. And sometimes Gus would come by the window and look in, stone-faced, and would just stare. If you waved at him, he would sort of crack a smile, turn, and leave.
Yeah, every so often he will screw with the elevator.
Elevator?
Yeah, the elevator in the back. He'll press the buttons just to make it go up and down. Or he'll press the emergency stop button, which sets off the bell. We don't use the elevator, and there is no reason to use it, but he just screws with it.
Wait a sec, you're telling me that you have a ghost in Gus, and he screws with the elevator?
Dude, don't you know what this place was? Were you not curious why some guys call this place the home?
I heard you mentioned it but never thought about it.
Old man Levinson purchased this building when he moved the radio station here. It was an old funeral home.
Rick then went on to explain that the elevator was used to take the bodies on gurneys down to the basement where the embalming room was located. Seeing my doubt, he put on a long album cut of Don Williams, and we had 12 minutes to go look. In the back of the building, by a pair of double doors leading to the outside, was an elevator. It was the kind like you would see in a hospital, longer than wide. We took the stairs because Rick said that sometimes someone or something would emergency stop the elevator between the basement and first floor, and you would be trapped. When we got to the basement, it looked like what you might expect an embalming room to look like. 3 stainless steel tables, a shelf of chemicals, some odds and ends of tools, rubber hoses, tanks of chemicals, all tile floors and walls. I was completely blown away, no freaked out. We went back up to the studio, and the first thing Rick said to me,
Hey, you had to ask. You started it.
Over the next week I found out more about the place. Hy Levinson, the radio station owner, had purchased the old funeral home because he wanted some big rooms for the studios, and although a funeral home, this place fit the need and was at the right price. Hy was cheap. The station was 50,000 watt WCAR 1130 AM in Detroit. Monster of a radio station. You can find its history online. At 4 a.m. I figured I'd better leave before the news department came in and Rick might get into trouble for having guests. Rick and I kept in touch for a long time, and filled me in on other things that happened afterwards, such as the girls in office having their hair played with while sitting at their desks, whispers in a quiet room, things being knocked off the tables, or a stack of papers would blow off a table with no breeze detected. Many people who worked there had experiences. One who didn't, but knew of the history, was George Norrie of Coast to Coast AM. He was in the news department in the early 1970s. He's talked about it being haunted, but never had an experience. As I left the studio that night, I figured I would turn left at the end of the hall and hit the men's room before my trip home. I lived about 30 minutes away and I needed to see a man about a horse. As I turned the corner, I stopped in shock. Gus was about 20 feet away, standing in front of the restroom door. I could see the word men's through him. I turned around and hustled out of the place, and only went back one other time to sit with Rick. That time I witnessed his pen get knocked off the desk, followed by Rick's angry comment.
Come on, knock it off. I'm just trying to make a living.
Rick was unfazed by it, saying that he saw worse things in NAM. He also said nobody was ever harmed, and that 3 other entities were seen at times, including an old man dressed in 1940s-style clothes, and a mustache, holding his hands in front of him, looking down. The room they would always see him in was where the body was viewed.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more Greentexts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.